Hello, welcome in everyone. I hope you're all well. This is like the first time I've spoken today, so I feel a bit like out of practice. If you're new here, welcome in. My name's Charlotte. I do monthly reading wrap-ups, and if you're a returning viewer, welcome back. I feel like this is going to be a long video because I read 9 books in June, which is definitely the higher end of what I usually read in a month. I had a great reading month in May, and I said I wanted to have a great reading month in June, and that I did. I just feel like I'm really on a roll at the moment. I'm really enjoying a lot of the books I read. I think I've kind of taken on a new tactic of making sure I don't read the same genre twice, like back to back, and it's really helping. It's just keeping me more interested and engaged, and even if I really want to read the same genre twice, I make sure I don't, and yeah, it's just going really well for me. Reading slump officially gone. Anyway, how are you all doing? I hope you're having good reading months. I am going to get straight into it because it's going to be quite a long video today, I think. Out of the 9 books I read, I had 4 physical. I did DNF one book that's not included in the 9 book total, but I'll talk about that at the end. That's an audiobook, and then everything else I think was on my Kindle. Oh, I had 1 audiobook. Okay, so I had 4 physical books, 4 digital books, 1 audiobook, and 1 audiobook DNF. We got there in the end. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. I always say this, but if you see me glancing down, it's because I'm just glancing down at my notes so I can properly talk about the books that I'm reviewing today. If this is your first time seeing one of my book videos, I don't really do any kind of spoiling of books, and if I do, I give you ample warning and plenty of time to get away. Just bear in mind that I am kind of reviewing the books in as much information as you can read about on the back of them. So yeah, while my reviews are in depth, don't worry, you're safe from spoilers. The first book I read was a digital book. I read this on my Kindle, and it is The Bond That Burns by Briar Berlin. Part of a series, it's Bloodwing Academy Book 2, and it's a romantasy book. Brief synopsis: Medra Pendragon has somehow survived year 1 at Bloodwing Academy by the literal skin of her teeth, and now she's entering year 2. So she is sequestered away in a tower for the summer while multiple high blood houses vie for control over her. They want her attention, they want her loyalty, and they want her dragon legacy. She did think she could trust Blake, but he has betrayed her multiple times now, and unfortunately she is bound to him for the foreseeable future as she is his blood source. So I know I said all that stuff about spoilers. This is the second book in a series, so I just think there are naturally some events that are spoiled if you haven't read book 1. I won't be doing spoilers for book 2, but just bear in mind if you plan to read book 1, book 2 is naturally going to spoil what happens in book 1. I haven't explained that very well, but I think such is the nature of reading and reviewing series. So just bear that in mind. I am going to talk about the events in book 2, which will kind of automatically lead to me talking about the events in book 1. If you would like to skip forward to the end of this review, I'll put the timestamp on the screen. Please get away now. If you haven't read book 2, don't worry, I won't be spoiling anything that happens in book 2. So I can say that I was pretty invested in this series. You can see my review for book 1 in my May reading wrap up. I read it right at the end of May, and then I literally just went straight into book 2. I thought I should wait, but I'm quite bad with unfinished series. I forget a lot of what happens, so I just went straight into it. I haven't had a romantasy book in a while that's made me feel like I really want to know what happens next, so I just thought I'd ride with that feeling. Book 1 ends on quite a big cliffhanger as well, so it just kind of naturally tilts you into reading book 2 straight away. And I have really mixed feelings about this book, if I'm honest. I feel like we're immediately thrown into a very chaotic, upside down scenario, which is very compelling, but feels a lot sloppier than book 1. To me, this feels like classic book 2 in that book 2s and sequels always sprawl very widely, especially in fantasy. It feels like there's always a lot of loose ends and a lot of chaos is happening, and it kind of acts as the setup for book 3. And obviously that seems really obvious, I know that makes sense, but usually when book 1 is quite tight and concise and like very into like the world building, book 2 often feels a bit directionless in multi-book series, especially like trilogies or series with 4 books, and then in book 3 everything kind of ties up and culminates. I didn't really enjoy the first half of book 2 purely from like a characterization standpoint. I don't know, I feel like the characters are being so messy, but in a way that doesn't feel right to the characterization or true to them. Everyone feels like they are acting out of sorts. Understandably, the events of the book are quite crazy. They are having conversations and behaving in ways and doing things day to day that doesn't feel to me right to the characterization, and it doesn't feel like true to them as people. A prime example for this for me was Blake, because he really pissed me off in this book. Blake is under loads of pressure from his family, you know, to make all these decisions, to act a certain way. Totally get that. But I feel like we went from book 1 where we kind of get this lover boy arc, and he basically just concedes to Medra and is like, you're the powerful one. And he has all this desperate yearning and, you know, this kind of like worshipping angle. And then all of a sudden we get this U-turn in book 2 where his actions just completely don't make sense to me. He turns into this really hateful and mean person, which obviously we saw a little bit of in book 1. It was kind of like a bullies to lovers type situ. Like, he is a bullying, selfish character by nature, but his and Medra's relationship at the start of book 2 just like really didn't make any sense to me. I felt like I'd missed something, not just enemies to lovers, but in like a he's genuinely a piece of shit kind of way. And then it just flips really suddenly. Like, it flips really suddenly with very little effort from him. And I understand that hate and love walk a similar line, like they walk a passionate line, especially in these kinds of books. It just doesn't feel very well written, and I feel like they have a lot of sexual chemistry, but they actually don't have like a basis for a relationship. They don't have a shred of friendship between them. There is no bond aside from the whole blood source thing, but obviously that's like a physical bond again. That's not like an emotional and mental bond. And there's been no kind of relationship building at all. So when you strip away the physicality of them and their physical chemistry, I just think like they're actually not very convincing to me. I just feel like they don't know each other very well. For book 2 as well, I feel like there's just been so many plot points introduced, and I won't spoil any of them, but it really is like a huge amount of different plot points that have been added to this book. Some of them are quite obvious. You can smell them and see them coming a mile off, and I just think like, okay, that's romantasy for you. But for me, a lot of the ones, especially regarding Medra and Medra's mother, haven't really been picked back up or addressed. Maybe they'll come back in book 3, but it was kind of like we got a bit of it at the start and then we forgot about it completely. It's like the author forgot about it. It just flip-flops from post to pillar, and I guess ultimately for me, I didn't feel as connected to this book as I did to the first one. I didn't feel much connection to the characters in this book either. The last 40% of the book is marginally better. This is where it picked up a bit for me. The writing feels more concise, it feels clearer, it's less repetitive, and it has much more direction. But also then the pacing for like the latter half of the book does move at fucking breakneck speed. Like, it goes so quickly. In my opinion, the first 60% of the book felt like filler. And at this point, I do feel like I will read book 3. I think it might end up being a 4-book series, but I think I will read book 3 because of the nature of the plot points and, you know, cliffhangers. And I'm hoping that it will start to improve, because so far it's like one good book, one semi-okay book, not a great book. And I just think with a really great editor, this could be a really great series. There's a lot of repetition in the writing, there's a lot of continuity errors and a lot of spelling errors, but it has a lot of potential. I do really hope it's like 3 to 5 books tops in the series, because I just don't think we need another book series that is 9 books. Anyway, to summarise, I didn't enjoy reading book 2 as much as I did book 1, but I am overall looking forward to the next book in the series. Anyway, my next book was a physical book, and it was Near the Bone by Christina Henry, and this is a horror book. So our main character, Mattie, lives on a remote mountainside in a cabin with her husband, William. So they live a very simple life, and she doesn't actually remember or recall a time when they didn't live there. She spends her days trying to placate his anger by being the perfect little trad wife. One day she discovers the body of a very mutilated fox in the woods and has the inkling that maybe they aren't as alone as she thinks they are. And something has been living in the woods alongside them. Shortly afterwards, 3 strangers show up on the mountaintop, also looking for this creature, and Mattie realises this means trouble for all of them, the strangers included. This started out as really promising for me, and didn't really end up quite landing. So it's a supernatural horror that is involving cryptids and is cryptid based, very monsters / cryptids, and is playing a lot on the fear of the unknown. You know, like slashing claws from the black kind of vibe, this kind of energy of you never know what's out there, you never know what's stalking you. And I think that energy in horror can be really great. It's quite good at playing up a lot of tension. Sometimes it's scarier than actually seeing the creature, you know. I will say it's heavily violent from all angles. Like, other than the creature and the typical like horror gore, there's emotional violence, there's physical violence and abuse, there's emotional manipulation, there's like murder involved, and just general like horror gore. If you're unsure on the concept of cryptids, cryptids are basically like animals, monsters, creatures whose existence is unproven, and it's usually based in some kind of like folklore passed down through generations stories. Like, it can be a bit horrorish, but it's not always. So like, I think the Loch Ness monster is technically classed as a cryptid. So like Bigfoot and Sasquatch would be considered a cryptid. It's like a big subculture of horror, like movies, people online that like love researching into it. It's quite interesting, but I feel like people love cryptids. I'm pretty sure like Chupacabra is a cryptid as well, you know, like that that Spanish like folklore. I don't think it's Spanish, but I think Chupacabra is like a Latin American thing. There's no need for me to debate on cryptids, so let's get into it. It started out for me as very, very strong, and I felt very invested in Matty and William's story. I really, really liked the snowy, remote mountainside cabin setting. I think there's not a lot of snowy horror. I do read a lot of horror, but I often read a lot of like southern horror, like southern gothic. So I really like the change of setting into like a snowy Canadian feeling wilderness. The suspense at the beginning is really strong, and we get this kind of like slow realization that Matty is experiencing, where she's getting like snippets of her memory back and she realizes her life isn't quite what it seems. And that was a really good technique for building suspense, because it really actually kept me invested in the story as well, because I wanted to know where the hell Matty's come from. She starts to like break out of this hold that he has on her, but then about 35% of the way through it just became a bit weak for me. The characters, I think, is where a lot of the weakness lay. The 3 extra people that turn up are really, really annoying. The way that the other 3 people react to things, for me, it just isn't believable. Like, they're not convincing at all. I can't think of any tangible examples, but there was just some weird sentences and weird reactions to things that I didn't think would happen if you were in a life-threatening situation. And obviously, like, who am I to say how someone should react in a life-threatening situation? But that just wasn't believable at all. What the book ends up being is just the same situation a few different times, written in a slightly different way, in just like a few variations, like, oh, we're being stalked by a monster at the bottom of the mountain. Oh, we're being stalked by a monster in the cabin. It just kind of feels like you're reading the same scene over and over again. There isn't enough variation, and it kind of culminates into nothing as well. I just kept waiting for something to happen, but I was just left wanting more. The internal voice that Matty has, like the internal monologue narration thing, added absolutely nothing to the story for me. There was some flashbacks of her previous life that I thought were fairly interesting, but again, I think actually with the internal monologue and the narration, we just end up getting too much of it, and it stops being interesting, because that honestly, I think, comprises about 50% of the story. They are just too frequent. We have too much of this weird internal conversation, and we just get endless flashbacks. I don't think they were utilised particularly well or in a way that added to the plot. It just becomes too much to be interesting. This is going to sound quite rude, but the writing almost felt like a bit juvenile, and I don't mean juvenile in like a young adult way, like I was reading a YA novel, but it just didn't feel like it was written well. It's very simplified, but in a way that, instead of being clear, came across as childish. Feels like I'm reading like a creepypasta or, you know, like a horror Reddit, but even then there's a lot of amazing authors on those forums, so it just felt like a really bog standard self-published horror novel. I don't usually rate books on these videos anymore, but I do on my story graph just so that I can get my stats at the end of the year, and I think giving this a 3 was actually really generous, so I might knock it down to a 2, because actually thinking back on it, I barely remember it, and to be like really honest with you, I just wouldn't bother reading this. Next up is The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim, and this is also a horror. Ji-won's life is turned upside down when her father has an affair and leaves her mother, also leaving her and her sister. Her grades start spiraling downhill, her mother is left distraught, and her sister is very confused and hurt. She starts having dreams of eyes. As we all would. Blue eyes, specifically, similar to that of her mother's obnoxious new American boyfriend, George. George is very unpleasant. He brags about his boring job, he fetishizes Asian women and girls, and he is rude and condescending to Ji-won and her sister. He doesn't deserve them, quite frankly, and he doesn't deserve Ji-won's mother, and Ji-won won't let him have them. Ah, yes. An unravelling woman, a genre I know very well, and a woman I love to read about. This read as more of a psychological horror for me. It slowly reaches boiling point, like very slowly, and it has a really grotesque and vulgar quality to the story and the writing, which I kind of love to hate. It really twisted my stomach quite a lot. It's a bit of a strange one, because when I finished it, I didn't really feel that impacted by it, and I didn't really think that I loved it that much. I didn't really know how to feel about it, and actually on reflection, I did quite enjoy the book, but I definitely didn't love it. I think this is in part due to how slowly the story ticks along. The pacing is very slow of this book. It's a very ominous, kind of like plodding along. You do get the sense that something bad is going to happen, but you're not really sure. And if I'm completely honest, to speak my truth, when I picked this up, I didn't read the blurb. I didn't know it was a horror. I don't often read blurbs of books, especially if I'm reading them on Kindle. I just will literally just pick them based on the vibe. So yeah, I didn't actually know this was a horror. So imagine my surprise when my sense of ominous foreboding turned out to be right. I had surmised from the cover and the title that I think this was going to be a bit of an odd one, but yeah, I was correct in that. I just didn't expect it to be quite so yucky. Ji-won's descent into madness and like her ongoing obsession with eyes was very interesting, but may I say that it almost didn't convince me. The reader wasn't really shown her spiral enough for it to feel super convincing. What I got is that it was so subtle, and then all of a sudden she was really quite unwell. We do get some moments of oddity kind of like sprinkled in here and there. Maybe they were too subtle, or maybe they just went straight over my head. What we get is a lot of madness that is displayed to us as the reader through dream sequences. And I am really not a fan of dream sequences, I'm afraid. I find them quite hard to engage with. I find myself checking out a lot in dream sequences. They did have a purpose in this book, obviously, but I just really wasn't connecting with a lot of them. We do also see her descent into madness through like her performance at school and her failing grades and everything. That's obviously a large portion of it. This book provides a good look into actually quite a wide range of subjects, and subjects that I personally find really interesting. So we get a lot about family dynamics, especially within Korean culture, and how divorce is dealt with in Korean culture, especially cross-generationally. There's a lot about racism and cultural appropriation versus appreciation, linked in with how people fetishize a lot of East Asian cultures. We've got misogyny, we've got a lot about food insecurity and poverty, and I really liked those angles of it actually. I quite enjoy that cultural commentary. It gives me quite a lot of insight. I feel like I learned a lot from it. I did really hate the whole horror being based around eyes, and I say hate, I mean it kind of lightly, just because eyes give me the squick a bit. I don't really like that. It was a challenging read. There was a lot of textural stuff. There was a lot of things around texture and flavour that knocked me sick. There is a lot of reference to taste, which I don't actually think you often get in cannibalistic horror. Obviously you get this kind of sense of like everything's meaty, or like, you know, it tastes really good, but there was an element of eyes being quite savoury. It's like maybe gag. Savoury, salty and liquidy. It's making my mouth water because it's making me feel a bit sick. And you know what? I really respect it because it's a challenging read. I don't get sick very often. I read a lot of horror and it doesn't really turn my stomach usually, but it's just something specifically about reference to taste and flavour and eyes. I think because I'm quite a foodie. I've eaten like fish eyes before. That's like a big part of the book as well. My mum used to eat the fish eyes. And like I quite like them, but maybe I don't like them so much anymore. It always took me a little while to get used to that when I was younger. You know, when you like roast a whole fish, my mum would always eat the eyes. That's fine. Good for you. I have really visceral memories as well of like dissecting a cow's eyeball in biology, which is just quite frankly horrifying. I had a lot of real life experience with eyeballs to like cross-reference in relation to this book. Just was like quite foul. The book plods along at a very slow pace, right up until it doesn't. Like then it moves very, very fast, very, very wildly and very, very violently. I did really just want to love it, but for some reason I didn't. I just enjoyed it. I just liked it. Good, but not great. A lot of people love this, and I got a lot of responses to my story when I posted this on my Instagram asking for the review and asking what I thought, and a lot of people just saying they loved it, but it didn't just quite hit for me in the way that I wanted it to. It's not that it wasn't good, and honestly it's short enough that I would say if you are interested in reading it and you want to give it a go, just do it, because it's an experience, I think. The sun's gone in quite a lot and I feel like it's gotten really dark in here, so sorry with the lighting changes. Next book I read digitally. It's a big one, it's a big review, got a lot to say. I read Mile High by Liz Tom Ford, and it is a sports romance, specifically a hockey romance. I don't often read a sports romance. Stevie, our main character, is a flight attendant and she's landed a job based out of Chicago where she lives with her twin brother. The job is being an air hostess on a private jet for the NHL. I can't remember the name of the team in the book, sorry. It's on this flight that she meets Xanders. That's his second name. Xanders. I'm gonna call him Xanders because I long A things because I'm English. Xanders is an egotistical, womanizing co-captain of the team. He's known as Chicago's notorious NHL playboy and, you know, has a woman in every single city. He's insufferable, and he is insufferably good looking, as the best ones always are in these books, not in real life. Stevie has a rule with herself, and she's always promised to never hook up with anyone she works with or works for. Trapped on this private jet a few times a week with Xanders, she's starting to think maybe she can bend the rules a little bit. This has been in my Kindle library for months, and I feel like I finally gave in to reading it, especially because I haven't really read a huge amount of romance lately. I'm really off romance and fantasy, sort of. I had a bad experience, yeah, with a hockey romance after reading Pucking Around, which I think was one of the worst books I've ever read in my whole entire life. So I haven't really been keen to revisit specifically hockey romances. I have read a couple of sports romances actually, I think, but I have been desperate for a decent billionaire romance. So I think that's kind of what led me to this. That was a secondary characteristic, that it was a hockey romance. I just wanted a billionaire romance. I want to fantasize about money being no object. What can I say? I'm just a simple woman. My initial thoughts were that this wasn't really like bad or anything. It was a pretty okay read. It was very compelling, and it held my interest, which is hard, I think, for a lot of romance to hold my interest these days beyond the smut, you know? This, for me, was a slutty little palette cleanser book. This is what I do with books in between genres, but I don't really know what I want to read. I just want something to reset the playing field, forgive the pun, and just, you know, cleanse my palette. Just something to reset while I decide what I want to read next. The spice was good. Their banter and chemistry was quite convincing and compelling. I quite enjoyed that. The banter did feel quite natural. Sometimes in books it doesn't really land, but this was good. I liked a lot the other characters in the book, the side characters. You know, I'm always really invested in a side character. So we had Xander's best friend and his wife, which is the other co-captain. I really liked them. It felt like they had a good relationship. The other boys on the team, Stevie's brother, I just really liked that little world that was built. It's obviously set up that way on purpose because it makes you want to read the other books in the series, but I think that is done really well. I felt quite invested in the side characters, and you know, I could go on to read the other books. I don't know if I will, but it's good to know that I can just pop in whenever I want and read some more about them. Plus size representation, complex family dynamics for both characters. Love black girls in sports romances. Some really nice kind of extra topics hit that I liked. I have a few issues with this book though, as I always do with like all books basically. These were all kind of in retrospect. I felt like it was all right when I finished it because I kind of binge read it, and then I was like, hang on a minute, let me put my critical hat on. A few things were rubbing me up the wrong way a little bit about this book. Firstly, just a small minor thing is this book was way too fucking long. The length of it's crazy. It's like over 600 pages, and I honestly couldn't tell you really what happened. It feels honestly way too long for a romance, and I think it could have been shaved down to about 400 pages. Although I will say I think it is the length it is because there are so many conversations about mental health, and the characters do get a bit deeper in this book than they do in other books, and I do get that that kind of dialogue lends itself to lengthy conversations, which is probably why it was so long, because there are a lot of those conversations. So thus is the nature of the book, but still. So let's get into characters. I want to talk Stevie first. I mainly liked Stevie for the most part. I do think she leans quite heavily into the not like other girls trope, which always is a bit jarring for me. Maybe it's taken a bit too far at times. So she loves comfy clothes. She's a very casual person. She goes out in sweats and trainers and very beat up trainers. She drinks beer. She doesn't give a fuck generally. Like, she's always going on about how she loves a craft IPA. And there are some moments that I'm a bit like, question mark? Going out with food on your chin, mustard specifically, I think, knowing it's there but also not really making an effort to wipe it off because you don't care, reads as a little bit grotty to me. Maybe that's mean of me. I only say that in a light-hearted way though. Stevie's character, other than that, is well-rounded. I love a girl that has complexities. I love a girl that has hobbies. She enjoys a lot of crafting. She has other passions outside of her job, outside of her man. I need my character to be well-rounded and like a 360-degree person before they meet the love interest. She's cute. I really enjoyed her little quirks. My heart kind of aches for her. She has a lot of self-esteem issues and a lot of problems surrounding her weight and her self-image. And also hearing her struggles about keeping and making friends made me a little bit sad because my heart hurts about that. So something that did make me double take, which I will raise, is I was looking at reviews on Goodreads afterwards, and I think it was Bookish by Tammy left a review about this a while ago. And bearing in mind, I'd already read it at this point, so I couldn't unread it. Bookish by Tammy rightly pointed out that Stevie's curly hair is often described as untamable, wild, unmanageable, and crazy. The reviewer then goes on to say that for a white author to write about their mixed race female main character in such a way in 2023 or 20, I can't remember what the year was, but for them to write about them in that way is very, very disappointing and unacceptable, and I would be inclined to agree. I was reading it on Kindle, and then Tammy also pointed out that the words have actually since been removed from the Kindle version, those terms used to describe her hair, but they haven't been removed from the audiobook, which is what Tammy was listening to. I think she was doing like a immersive read, doing both. I just saw that and I thought it's really, really disappointing. It's lazy writing, and yeah, in 2025, 24 and 23, like even before that, it is unacceptable. There are so many other effective ways to describe curly hair, and I think it's really disappointing. I think probably for that reason I won't be going forward to read any more of this author's books, just because I think like I don't need that energy. To some of you that may probably seem like a little heavy-handed of me, but I know what I want to read. I know who I want to support as a mixed race woman reading books. So let's talk more about other characters such as Xander's. This is complex for me because ultimately by the end of the book I enjoyed him and Stevie together, and I enjoyed his and Stevie's relationship. Overall, this is like kind of me being a bit nitpicky in retrospect. I hold my romance men to a high standard. His soft side is lovely. I love a man that rightly so worships the ground his counterpart walks on. But if I'm honest, I'm going to be a Debbie Downer and say that Xander's is a hard sell for me. The Xander's at the start of the book, you're not convincing me that that is the same man at the end of the book. Now, I know that's reductive of me because on first glance, that sounds like I'm saying I don't think men are capable of change. And you're gonna have to hear me out. I understand that he's also a fictional character, so it's not that deep, is it? People can change and develop. People do change and develop. That is actually the whole point. But I cannot ignore that at the start of the book, he's a disgusting, misogynist Lothario. It's like it's almost been taken a bit too far for me. I don't know. Like, yeah, he's got this bad boy image that he keeps talking about, you know, it's I'm not that guy, Stevie, like I'm not this, I'm this person for the press, I'm who they want me to be to make me some money. But like also Xander's, you did it. But at the start, he literally still engages and does all that stuff he doesn't want to, supposedly. He treats service workers like shit in the books. Like that's his thing. He treats people like shit. He has a fucking list in his phone of all the girls in every city, but he just calls them by their city name because he can't remember their name. And then he writes something notable down about their sexual performance, like gives great blowies. Like, yes, I get that he changes at the end of the book, but honestly, I think the playboy trope here is hammered home so hard for so long that it's actually quite difficult to unsee it by the end of the book, for me at least. In romance books, especially like billionaire and rich romance books, there is this kind of, you know, dickhead billionaire type trope. I get that, I understand that, but this is extended so far to everyone in the book. Like he extends that awful treatment to so many people, it's almost a bit hard to redeem him. In a lot of rich romance books, they'll seem really tough and really awful to like other rich people, but they'll always be nice to service workers, they'll always be nice to like animals and children and people. But yeah, I think maybe he took it too far. This is a hard redemption for me because he's rude to so many people and he thinks it's so funny. He is very selective with the women he chooses to respect, and you know what, sue me, but I don't think that's sexy at all. And I do think the misogyny actually spills out into quite a lot of the book. We're supposed to make peace with Xander's like dropping trow at every single fucking girl he sees, you know, but we also have Stevie like calling girls puck bunnies and like jersey collectors or jersey chasers or whatever the term she uses, and it's a bit slut-shamey from Stevie. I don't know, in retrospect, maybe that all sounds really negative. I'm aware I've been reviewing this book for 17 minutes, that's what it says on my camera. And I said this book was okay, and I do think it was okay considering I had like a fairly light time reading it. I had low expectations and I went into it feeling a bit like head empty. I just wanted like a nice, smooth read. I think if you can take your books with a huge, huge pinch of salt, you will probably just enjoy this this for what it is. It's like a fun read, right? If you're a really voracious reader of sports romance and romance in general and you haven't already read this, you'll probably quite enjoy it. Bit of a mixed review, but hopefully you understand what I mean. I suppose though that is the point of these videos, is to give you like all angles of my reading experience. And I do think, yeah, I like to give you a thorough, well-rounded reading experience. And I do think I just hold my male love interest to a high standard. I've read a lot of romance in my life. Sorry, I just don't want him to be rude to people. So the next book I read was an audiobook, and it was Morning Star by Pierce Brown, which is Red Rising Book 3. It is a sci-fi dystopian fiction book. So this will be a fairly boring review, I think, if you haven't read the other two books, because it's quite vague. And obviously, like I mentioned earlier with the first book, when you review in a series, you have to talk about what's previously happened in the series. So like I said earlier, such is the nature of reviewing series that it will contain spoilers for the earlier books in the series, but I won't be spoiling anything that happens in this book. But just be cautious if you haven't read the first two books and you're planning to, because even the synopsis contains some kind of inkling as to what happens. Darrow's enemies have brought him war. They have publicly killed his wife, they have captured him, they have trapped him, they have demanded his piety, his fealty and his obedience, and he is still fighting them back. His enemies are merciless, and among his enemies are actually some people that he probably used to consider friends. It's time for Darrow to win the war and unleash the revolution, and to do so, he has to lift those in shackles from the darkness and liberate them to claim their identity and their birthrights. So someone, I think either last year or earlier in the year, whenever I read book 2 and I did that reading wrap up, they recommended that I listen to the dramatized audio book of this on Kindle, because after I read book 2, I was at a point where I wasn't really sure if I wanted to continue with the series. I just didn't feel that invested in it. And it's quite like epic fantasy and sci-fi. I'm not historically very good with reading that. I find it quite dense. But thank God you recommended that I do it this way, whoever you are. I can't remember your username, but it was so much more engaging listening to the dramatized audio than it was reading it. If you've never read a dramatized audio, it's basically a movie for your ears. It's fully casted. There was music, there was fight sounds, there's like lots of layered audio. So while conversations are going on, you've got fading out music, you've got people dying on the battlefield, etc. I really enjoyed the setup of it. It added a lot of drama, as the name suggests, obviously, and it did take a minute to get used to, but the listening experience was really, really fun. I usually don't really love sci-fi and fantasy on audiobook because I personally find it quite disconcerting not knowing how like new languages and terms are spelt, and I need to see it written down on the page to understand what it is I'm hearing. But because I'd read the first two on Kindle, those terms and like that language and the characters were already quite well established in my mind, so that really helped. I just feel like if I can't see the names of things, especially if they're words that we don't typically have in like the English language, I can't make it real. So much happens in this book that I can't honestly really remember it, and I listened to it over quite a long period of time. Like I can't remember very specific events, give a few here or there. I know that I did enjoy this a lot more than book 2. I had a better sense of what was happening and I had a better sense of the characterization. I felt like I knew everyone a lot more in this book. I mentioned it in my old review, but I think one of the reasons I do enjoy this series so much is because Pierce Brown as an author feels very merciless. We get the sense that no one is really safe. He is willing to kill off anyone to make any kind of twist and any kind of turn. And I don't think a lot of authors really do that anymore. Alliances in this series can change so swiftly, but in a way that never feels not true to the characters and not true to the plot. Nothing ever really felt too bizarre, and that sense of that carried over really well into this book. I will say there is a cycle and a formula that he likes to use a lot, and it's kind of this win to disaster to desolate despair, then comes a rousing speech to rally the troops, then into an epic battle that was just kind of rinse and repeat. It's a classic Red Rising saga cycle, I think. What we see from Darrow as well is that he loses his edge in this book. I think we see him start to make some very, very rash decisions. I guess it's from the trauma of everything, but we do see him start to unravel, and it always seems like every decision he makes, he cannot make without the support or backing of someone else. He can't make a decision by himself. The book was pretty consistent with the others in the series in that it was very action-packed, but one thing I will say is the pacing was really strange in this book. I don't mean strange like in a bad way, just strange in that it was noticeably different for me. I feel like it goes very fast, then very slow, then very fast and very slow. And we kind of have this chop change of the pacing and what happens. There's a lot of big epic stuff happening. Then there's a really long period of kind of strategy and just rinse and repeat again. This book felt more formulaic, but maybe that's because I have the knowledge now of what it is like reading the other two books. With all of that in mind, maybe the ending felt a bit rushed for me. I wanted a bit more from the storylines of the Jackal and Octavia, but also the book wasn't really about them. I had some disappointment for Darrow and Mustang's relationship. I do understand that there is an element of rebuilding here at play. You know, you can't just go from nothing. They've got to start the trust element again. But I just wanted a bit more warmth from them. It's the warmth that we kind of miss from the earlier books. But then that being said, they were very, very young in book one and a lot of time has passed. War does change people. War does make you cold. They are very traumatized. They've lost a lot. They've gained a lot, but at what cost? That kind of thing. Overall, book three never quite reclaimed the excitement that I had when reading book one, but I am very glad I listened to it versus reading it on Kindle. I really think it would have dragged for me and I would have felt really bored. Book two for me was really boring, but maybe that would be better on dramatised audio as well. Book three redeemed itself, but not all the way. I think overall this is a very good series if you like epic high sci-fi and fantasy, very dense sci-fi and fantasy that's lore heavy. If you like books about being the breaker of the system and the changer of worlds, overthrowing high society and revolutions and space travel, it was okay. It wasn't great for me, it was good. That's the theme of a lot of today's books, I think, a lot of June's books. But I will say I am very happy that I read a series that I would consider out of my comfort zone, and honestly, like 2 years ago I probably never would have even thought that I'd pick a book like this up. I think it was out of my reading comfort zone, and for that I'm really proud. I won't go to read the spin-off because I know there is like a continuation of a slightly separate series of books, but for me the ending felt complete. The series felt complete to me as the three. The next book I read was another Kindle. I read This Could Be Us by Kennedy Ryan. It is the Skyland series book 2 and it's a romance. Soledad Barnes is exactly what you would describe as type A. She has everything planned out in her life. Plans and schedules everything, designs everything, makes and organises everything. She does it flawlessly. She's what I would consider a domestic goddess. She runs a tight ship in her house. She has a solution for everything and a contact for everything, but she doesn't have a solution for when her life implodes in a cloud of betrayal and lies. And at the centre of this cloud and betrayal and lies is the man that she was meant to spend the rest of her life with. She has no time to feel sorry for herself. She's got to build her life from the ground up now to support her and her daughters. But during this process, a forbidden man enters the picture. Can she trust him? I read Before I Let Go last month, which is book 1 in the series, and I was really invested in continuing following that. So this follows Yasmin's best friend. Yasmin is our main character in book 1 and her best friend is Soledad, and they set you up quite well in book 1 to be like quite interested in her as a character. I really loved the first book, so I had quite high hopes for book 2 and I don't think I was disappointed at all. It wasn't my favourite by any means, but I did really enjoy learning more about Skyland and the Skyland community, and I was really invested in Soledad as a character. And honestly, I think if the book had had literally like zero romantic angle and had been about her rediscovering her relationship with herself and like growing as a person, I would have been happy with just that. You know, a story just following herself and her journey back to herself and rediscovering who she is, like without a romantic relationship, that still would have banged. As always, I think Kennedy Ryan did a really fantastic job of covering quite serious and heavy and deep topics in quite a realistic but like light-hearted way. Although I think the overall like plot of this one feels perhaps a bit more dramatic, it still feels very rooted in reality in terms of like the family dynamic and the practical steps that happen and how the characters interact with each other, and you know, these timelines for healing. I found that Kennedy Ryan always writes the healing angle and the healing aspect of the characters' journeys really well. The main emphasis of the book really does lie in Sol's journey and, you know, her dealing with the long-term grief and the loss of her mother, her coming to terms with the fact that she is now the sole provider for the family, finding her identity outside of being like a provider for her family and like a mother, and how she plans to get into her new career and build from the ground up, and the element of not having any financial stability. And the romantic relationship angle, while an integral part of the story, didn't feel like it eclipsed the focus on her personal growth and development or her relationship with her daughters. There was a good balance there. For me, the reason I didn't enjoy this book as much as the first one is this is honestly just a tiny personal preference. I find it really, really hard to feel as connected to books that reference like modern elements of social media so specifically, especially when they are referencing the social media site by name, so like TikTok and Instagram, and they're talking about trends that are relevant at the time of the writing of the book. I don't mind a book that has a modern reference to social media in kind of a timeless way, so it references social media pages or like mobile phones and stuff like that, but I find the very specific references just take me out of the book a little bit. So this is actually a really huge part of the book because there are a lot of these references, honestly, from start to finish, because Sol's career trajectory is that she becomes an influencer or, you know, like a content creator. She is very present on social media. So these references are all throughout the book. It's an integral part of the plot line. It's forgivable for me because I knew what I was getting into when I read the book, and I love to see her thriving, and I understand that it's part of the plot line. It's probably not something I would have chosen to read if it was like the first book, but I do find the Skyland series is generally quite modern in its references anyway. But yeah, those are my thoughts. I'm not sure if I'll read Hendrix's book yet, but I'm gonna see. I wish I was joking when I said that this has taken me 2 hours to film. Away from the digital and onto the physical books, the next book I read is Sula by Toni Morrison, and this is a classical fiction book. I say classical fiction because it's described as like a modern classic. Historical fiction. Sula Peace and Nell Wright are two young, poor black girls living out of a town in Ohio called Medallion. They are both lost in their own worlds. They are intelligent, they are lonely, and they have a habit of sharing everything with each other. Their secrets, their dreams, their happiness, their desires. They have shared experience. As they grow up, things change, and Sula breaks free from the community of Medallion and leaves in favour of the big city. She returns many years later and discovers that things have increasingly changed, including Nell, who now has 3 children and a husband, and their friendship begins to grow increasingly strained. Toni Morrison, the writer that you are. This was my first Toni Morrison book, and I am ashamed to say that I put it off for so long because I just was quite frankly intimidated. Hindsight is 2020, and I can now safely say that I wished I'd read it sooner. This was definitely one of the best books that I've read all year, if not the very best, which I'm happy to say, I'm comfortable saying that. So when I picked this up, I had this weird sense that I had absolutely no idea of what I was reading. The initial writing and setup is so lyrical that it feels almost nonsensical. It was really almost quite confusing to read, and I felt I was struggling to understand what I was reading. But now, having finished it, I feel this is almost part of the puzzle-like experience of the story. Those pieces that are feeling scattered at the beginning come together in a really satisfying way. It feels very natural, and I believe that this is part of the reading experience, and as I work my way through Toni Morrison's repertoire, I probably will get a better understanding of that sense and that writing style. Immediately I know I have to reread this to understand truly the complexity of the book at least once. I am the kind of person that reads quite fast naturally, and dare I say it, that when you read as a part of your career, as I do here, I think you tend to read a little faster, in my experience anyway. And that's not to say that you read any less quality or that you enjoy it any less than you would reading at a slower pace, but this is the kind of book that demands you to read slowly and luxuriously and thoroughly. It is so deliciously written that it demands your full attention and needs you to read at a slower pace than you usually would do. I really had to focus to read this book, and that just made my reading experience of it so much more atmospheric. The tone of the writing is almost so nostalgic, and it feels very heavy and weighted. I just don't think there is a word wasted. The tone of everything is almost quite sensual. It's really hard for me to put into words because I just read, I'm not like an author or a writer, and it's just such a rich book, and it's, like I said, really hard for me to put into words because it just feels so rich and so well constructed. The intensity of Nell and Sula's relationship has just quite frankly clocked me over the head. I think what I don't understand is how can decades of friendship be just put into 200 pages like this? How can all of the emotions that come with decades of friendship be captured so accurately in such a short space of book? Sula is a constant conflict throughout, but yet you find yourself empathizing with her, even though for so much of the book she is insufferable. But I think there's something so admirable about the fact that she is a controversial woman. She is living exactly the way she wants to, and she is constantly evolving and changing, and she is a contradiction, and she does all of that in a contradictory way, but it feels so natural for her character. I can't find the quote. I'm going to try find it. Couldn't find it in the book, but it's a quote between Nal and Sula at the end of the book. And it goes like this: I sure did live in this world. Really? What have you got to show for it? Show? To who? I got my mind and what goes on in it, which is to say, I got me. Lonely, ain't it? Yes, but my lonely is mine. Now your lonely is somebody else's, made by somebody else and handed to you. Chills. I just think it's brilliant. She doesn't give a fuck, and it elicits really strong reactions from literally everyone around her. From us as readers and from those in Medallion. There are just so many emotions that are covered over the course of this book and captured so well. They are written in such a complete and well-rounded way that I am struggling to review this. I'm struggling to review this in a way that is just not me telling you to go read it, although I do implore you to do that. There are levels and layers to this book that mean I could read it 5 times over and I still genuinely don't think that I would have grasped all the layers, all the intricacies and the complexities of the writing. And there are just so many times I wish I'd annotated or highlighted it, and I think I'll go back through and do that. This book is a blessing and I feel changed for reading it, and I don't think I can really measure its impact in a review like this. I spoke about it in my favourites video recently and I literally felt like I was going to cry, but I didn't even cry while I was reading it. I don't know how to articulate what happened. It's just something about how good of a book it is and how beautiful the writing is, and it deserves every single accolade it's ever gotten 10 times over, and all I would say is that you need to read it. It's genius. I honestly can't say anything more about this that's not already been said 100,000 times over by every other single review online. Love her so much. The lighting is really changing so drastically because I've now been sat here reviewing for 2 hours. This is how long it's taken me. My legs are really hurting, and honestly I've just been sat here like actually straight reviewing. I haven't even taken any breaks. I also sound really hoarse. Let's get on to the next book. The next book I read was a physical book, and it was Sunburn by Chloe Michelle Howarth. This is LGBTQ+ contemporary fiction. Wait, I think it's literary. I figured out the difference between them the other day. Okay, I've remembered. This is literary fiction because it is more character driven than it is plot driven. This book is set in the early 90s in the small Irish village of Crossmore. One of our main characters, Lucy, has a conventional path laid out for her. Marriage and motherhood with her closest childhood best friend, Martin, but none of it appeals to her. During one long hot summer, a spark with her other school friend, Susanna, escalates into an all-consuming infatuation. Fearful of the backlash from a small and conservative community, they start leading a double life. But school will end soon and she must make a decision between Crossmore or Susanna. I really loved reading this for so many reasons. I was really looking forward to reading this. When I bought it, actually, so many of you messaged me to tell me it was your favourite book, and when I posted it on my story to say I was reading it, I just was like flooded with messages about how much people love this book. I love LGBTQ+ fiction. I love Irish authors. You Irish can really write a book, huh? Catholic and religious imagery, hell yeah. Catholic and religious imagery that warps love into a form of worship, hell yeah. Gay Catholic yearning, hell yeah. Worshipping at the altar between her legs, hell yeah. This was actually a deeply emotional book. You know, when you're at school, when you're of school age and you are so wrapped up in like the daily machinations of school and your friendship group, and it just feels like it will never be over and that is your entire life. Like your day starts and ends with school. You know, when the most important thing in your life is going to school and like all of the daily intrapersonal like relationships and interactions and friendships. I know that sounds obvious because all of that actually is how you spend most of your time, especially if you had like a bad time at school. There's this like deep rooted feeling that you can't ever imagine your life without it, and you don't know what's going to happen when school ends. This is all I've ever known. It feels so ride or die, and this book captures that feeling so well. How all encompassing like the fishbowl of school is, and it really makes you ache for Lucy and Susanna and actually all of the other characters as well. I remember when I finished school and like I had a pretty bad time at school, like especially when I was younger, maybe not so much in like the finishing years, but I remember thinking after I finished school for months, and even I still get this sometimes now, I think no one's ever going to make me do that again. Like I never have to go back to school. I like couldn't believe it. I thought like, I'm never going to have to go to a maths class again. I never have to see these people again if I don't want to. I think it's a really good and accurate portrayal of first love, and the author's done like an amazing job of capturing those like long and drawn out, like hot, hazy summer school days, the all-consuming like quality of first love, like the petty squabbles between friends, all of the competing priorities. I did find myself a little bored in the book, I'm not gonna lie. I did feel like it was quite dragged out. Obviously the pacing for this book is just slower in my opinion. I felt quite connected to the romance angle. I thought that was really good, but the kind of in-between moments where we're without Susanna, I just felt like they went on a little bit. I didn't feel that interested in a lot of it. It had all of the classic Catholic religious yearning and guilt that I really enjoy from books. Lucy is absolutely suffocated by the Catholic guilt of her love for Susanna and, you know, the expectations of her village. She's really consumed with what everyone else will think of her. And I really actually loved the complexity of how Lucy as a child really needs her mother's love and approval and wants to be like the perfect person for her mother. But all the while, her mother is existing as this really narrow-minded woman, like shaped by her experience. I do actually think that angle gave me a lot of insight and a lot of compassion. We see Lucy constantly grappling with the fact that she will do anything to be her mother's girl again, to get this approval and love that a child so desperately needs from their mother and that should be unconditional. But she needs that so badly that she'll go to the point of suppressing herself. And I think when you live in a very like liberal area or you have very liberal experiences, it's hard sometimes to understand the thought process. Even if you can sympathize, you can't empathize. And I think it just gave me, especially from like a teenager's mind, that clarity on the decision process. How confusing that must be, especially for a child, when you want two things so desperately, but they both seem at odds with each other. It doesn't feel like they can coexist. To feel like you have to conceal yourself in order to get love and approval of others, especially your family. I also do think I didn't end up liking Lucy much as a character, but I think that's the point. At the core, it just ends up being like a deeply heartbreaking book, doesn't it? It's a very, very sad book, but with very important messaging. I liked it, but I didn't love it. I would probably recommend you read it because it was good, but I do just think at some points I found it a bit draggy. But then such is also the atmosphere and the time of the book. You know, it's a literary fiction book. It's much more character driven than plot driven. It is supposed to be long and drawn out, and we are very much living from the teenager's perspective. If you've been on my channel for a while, you know I do often struggle with a character driven book, so I think my review is entirely based on my reading experience and my preferences, because this is so highly rated for so many people. I don't think it's a reflection of the book itself, and this did have the hallmarks of everything that I usually love in a book. You Irish authors just keep doing it. The last and final book I read for the month is Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, and this is a sci-fi dystopian fiction, maybe a horror, question mark. Look how cool the inside cover is. I hate the outside cover, but it's because I bought it at 66 Books and I got the TV like adaptation cover. So I haven't actually written anything down for this book because I finished it and I didn't think I was gonna finish it in June. So I'm just gonna go off-piste and hope that I'm not too rambly. But this book is about a place called Area X. I'm assuming this is set someplace in the future, but it's quite hard to determine. And Area X is an untamed wilderness with a border that keeps encroaching on other land and increasing. The border is mysterious. We don't know how people cross the border. The Southern Reach, which I think are a branch of the government that are investigating Area X, keep sending out expeditions to this piece of land, and weirdly none of them return. Hardly any of them return. One expedition, everyone committed suicide. Another expedition, people went missing for months and then just mysteriously re-emerged in their loved ones' homes. Another expedition, everyone contracted deadly cancer. And now we follow 4 women who are embarking on the 12th expedition. I'm gonna watch this, I think. I think it has Natalie Portman in it. I'm not sure. I don't really watch much TV. Oh wait, it literally says in the back. Natalie Portman, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Oscar Isaac, Gina Rodriguez and Tessa Thompson. I love Tessa Thompson, so I'll watch that. One thing I will say about this is if you like a book that gives you answers, you won't like this. I don't know what the fuck has happened in this book. Like really, truly, I don't know what's gone on. But one thing I will say straight off the bat, I love, love, love a sci-fi or a horror that is rooted in nature and biology and has like a sense of organicness about it. You know, this like wilderness running rampant kind of element. For the spookiness and the slime and the yuckiness to be vines and twisty leaves and animals. Love. I have no idea about this. Nothing makes sense. The experience is quite like an unreliable narration experience. It basically follows like 4 people that are only referred to by their job roles. So we've got the psychologist, the surveyor, the anthropologist, and the biologist. And the biologist is the main character. There's this element of what do you do when you don't trust your own senses? There is a tower, but some people are calling it a tower and some people are calling it a tunnel. We're really taken back to like the basic agreement and instinct of like what it means to have conversation, what it means to perceive and understand things. They're not allowed to take any cameras in or like any modern devices. They journal everything, and it just becomes slowly more creepy and more unhinged. It feels like a fever dream. It's very unnerving, I think, this book, and there is something very unsettling about like biological horror and sci-fis to me, so I think that really helped. I do think about here onwards the book kind of adopts this feverish manic quality that some people will really like, some people won't, but it reaches a tipping point where as a reader you suddenly have 10 times more questions than you do answers, and I'm not sure I loved that, but it was a very interesting read. I think for me, when things are inconclusive, I find it really challenging because I love to know stuff. I love to know why. The more crazy things get, the more confused as a reader you get, and to me that is also a really immersive reading experience. It's very atmospheric, and I think some people will really enjoy this to like the fullest extent, and some people will be left feeling ultimately frustrated and like they didn't get what they needed from it. But I would actually just say read it and see what happens and have the experience. It was good, but like also it wasn't at the same time, but I can tell that that's my preference for having a tidy, neat story fighting my enjoyment of like a weird book. I'm sat here just like, what did any of this mean? Like, what happened? I've got so many more questions. And I think it is a trilogy, but I don't know. I don't really care to read the rest of it. I think the whole experience of this just feels like at any given moment, you're reading like one crazy long fever dream. Like if the ending, it's not by the way, but if the ending was like, and then I gasped awake, I would believe it because it becomes so unusual. There's this sense of like other planes shifting and reality shifting, and you know, this kind of tangent of like, I'm real and I'm not real. I exist, but does that exist because I look at it? You know, that this kind of line of thinking, I can't think of the name of it, but you know what I'm getting at, you know, if a tree falls in a forest. Following reading this, I'm left with like a bit of an absence of feeling that I'm not really sure how to move forward with it. But I'm gonna watch the movie. I think it's a movie, maybe it's a TV show. I don't know how they're gonna translate this into that. I think the movie will probably be more action-packed and like a bit more, you know, like Lost or one of these ones. Yeah. Question mark basically is how I feel about this. I was sucked in, but I was just ultimately left quite frustrated. But I think that's the point. I don't know. And then I'm really briefly going to talk about a book that I DNF'd this month that was an audiobook. And this may come as a surprise to some of you and maybe a disappointment to some of you, but I have DNF'd Butter. I've been listening to it for about 10 hours and I have 17 hours. And honestly, I am sick of reviewing by now because I've been going at it for about 2.5 hours and I don't want to sit and talk about a book that I didn't like. I just found it really boring. I almost really enjoyed it and I loved the descriptions of the food. You can look up the synopsis. It sounded great. I didn't read the physical version because I was actually quite intimidated by the density of the book and had seen quite mixed reviews. I just found it really uninspiring. I don't think I enjoyed the crime and thriller element of it so much. I don't really read that genre anyway, and I think I just got a bit bored of this kind of what's going on, will they, won't they? I do kind of understand the pacing is meant to be quite slow, and I understand that the style of writing is a different style, but I'm not unfamiliar with reading Japanese literature, Korean literature, and to me it just felt like overwritten. I really liked the food element of the book and I found it so interesting, and as someone that's very interested in like Japanese food and Japanese food culture, it wasn't enough to keep me interested. And I got about halfway through it and I just thought, I don't care. I literally don't care what happens. I was really invested for quite a short while and I just reached a point where I just thought, I actually don't care to know what happens anymore. It was just so so unbelievably slow. I'm sorry. If you really liked it, you really liked it. That's so fine. I just think the narrative could have been condensed into a lot of a shorter book, and I think they were trying to translate the sense of luxuriating in your food to luxuriating in the story, and it just really didn't work. There was no tension for me. There was no kind of like dynamic energy in this novel. I found the thriller element really boring. I felt like none of the decisions of the characters made much sense. I just didn't feel like any of the plot points were leading anywhere. We dangled a lot of almost threads and a lot of like half plots, and yeah, I just couldn't see it wrapping up in a way that felt satisfying to me, so I decided to not waste my time. And well done me, because I don't often DNF books. Anyway, I'll leave it at that because I don't want to shit on another book too much, to be honest. And that was everything I read in the month of June. That was a really long one. I hope it's not too long for you. I hope it's not too boring for you, and thank you so much for watching. I do have a BookTok account, so I'll put all of my socials in the description box, and I do upload on YouTube every Sunday and every other Wednesday. If you liked today's video, please leave me a book suggestion in the comments, or drop a like. Maybe you want to subscribe. It's been so lovely hanging out with you, and I'll see you on the next video.